Welcome to this public session of the Knight Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics. I'm Arnie Duncan, I'm one of the co-chairs of the Knight Commission, and Carol Cartwright and I will be sharing the facilitation duties today. Before I introduce President Emmert, just a couple quick reminders. First, this session is being live streamed, so I ask Commission members and our panelists to please use the microphones when speaking. And we're pleased to have the media and others here to listen to this discussion. And following the conclusion of this session, there'll be an opportunity for media to interact with the panelists. It's my pleasure to introduce Mark Emmert. He's been running NCAA for 7 years. I've had the chance to work with him throughout those 7 years. And I will say, whether it's publicly or privately, he's never been anything but honest and straight and sincere and passionate about making the NCAA a better place for student athletes. And this is obviously a challenging time for you. It's also a time of real opportunity. And look forward to, again, another candid conversation. When you're done with your presentation, I'm sure panelists will commission members will have some questions for you. Thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you very much. This structure is a bit like the last time I was in front of a group like this, it was my doctoral dissertation, I think, defense. So I'm hoping this is easier than that, though I survived the other and came out the other end. Well, first of all, thank you for providing me an opportunity to come and talk with you. Everybody here knows and is committed to the importance of intercollegiate athletics as an integral part of American higher education, and so it's a pleasure to get to see a lot of familiar faces and friends and to get a chance to talk about what are undoubtedly some very, very serious challenges that college sports face right now. I thought, Mr. Chairman and Ms. Chairman, if I might, I'd just make a few brief remarks because I'd much rather engage in a conversation with you and see what's on your minds, and we can learn some things from each other. Let me begin with the fairly obvious challenge that's been placed on all of our plates around men's basketball because of the revelations of the investigation by the Southern District in New York and the FBI. As we get through and sort through the sort of salacious headlines that have come out of that, which I think for everybody, I know everybody around this table, and I know from our recent board meetings with the Board of Governors, everybody in the NCAA governance model have been absolutely shattering in terms of the level of confidence that we have in some of the core assumptions around intercollegiate athletics. And as I've thought a lot about these issues, to me, they really aren't issues about just basketball or even just intercollegiate athletics for that matter. They really strike at two pretty fundamental notions, and that's, what kind of enterprise are we in higher education, and how do we govern it? The fact is that American higher education, this group knows, not the country as a whole probably, but this group understands that American higher education is unique in many, many ways. One of the most fundamental differences is that we engage in self-governance in American higher education. We don't have a national ministry of education. We have a secretary of education, obviously, Mr. Secretary. But it's quite different, as you would, I'm sure, agree, from a ministry of higher education or a ministry of sport or governmental entities that oversee higher education as they do in the rest of the world, right down to decisions about curricular content and about qualifications of faculty and work that in the U.S. we have from the very beginning turned over to self-regulation. Universities and colleges themselves hold themselves responsible for academic integrity. Universities and colleges themselves set up their own accrediting bodies and pass judgment on each other, whether it's the whole institution or whether it's your law school or your medical school or your chemistry department. All of those things are functions of a self-referential, self-policing process that requires that we stop and say, okay, how are we doing here? And that judgment is left to your peers. When the NCAA was formed over 100 years now, 110 years ago now, more than that, I guess 112 years ago, it was put together on that same fundamental principle, that the universities and colleges of America themselves were the appropriate entities for governing and overseeing this anomalous thing called college sport. Anomalous because the rest of the world doesn't do this either, anything like we do. So we started this process of overseeing each other, of schools themselves ceding responsibility and authority to a collection of universities that they called the NCAA, and they decided that collectively we would all make decisions together. We'd all hold hands and we'd all agree on the fundamental principles. We'd all agree on what the rules of the games would be and the ways in which we'd govern them. And we interestingly also agreed that we would self-regulate and self-police ourselves. And that's worked remarkably well, especially when you consider all the other options for more than 110 or 115 years. Coincident with that fundamental assumption about governance and oversight is that we have to also reflect on what business are we in. When you ask yourselves, what business are we in higher education? We're in the human development business. We're committed to developing young men and young women who come to our campuses to gain an education, to develop themselves physically and mentally, to acquire the capacity to go out after commencement and take on the world and do all the good things that we want and expect from all of our students. There has been, during that period of time, a lot of developments that have occurred that have called into question both of those fundamental principles. Right now, we live in a time where American society is looking at all of our institutions, every one of them, across the board, and saying, are these people capable of self-regulation? Whether it's Congress or business or medicine. When you look at public survey data again and again and again, right now the only entity that American people have significant confidence in is the military. So we have this point in time where people are saying, can you or can you not regulate the enterprises of your own activities? And it's not just in athletics, it's across the board in higher education. Indeed, when we just a couple of weeks ago surveyed the population, we conduct surveys all the time around trying to get public opinion data to know what are people thinking about college sports, what are they thinking about higher education. We found that when our pollsters asked the American public about universities and the relationships to their student athletes, 79% of Americans said big universities put money ahead of their student athletes. Now, I can't think of anything right now 79% of Americans agree to, but they agreed to that. 69%, when asked whether or not big schools and big school sport were part of the problem or the solution to the issues of college sports, 69% said those schools are part of the problem, not part of the solution. 51% said the NCAA was part of the problem, not part of the solution. Those are numbers that should cause us a lot of anxiety because that tells us what people are thinking of right now, our ability to manage our own affairs, not just in college sport, but in higher education. When you go back then and you look at the core mission of higher education, this mission of developing human beings, of human development, and you see juxtaposed against it some individuals who see it simply as skill development, as developing one's basketball skills so as to pursue a professional career with maybe a minor nod toward human development, but maybe even not that. You can see why people question what the enterprise is all about. If somebody is going to a campus for 6 months on their way to the NBA, it's hard for me to describe that as an effort in human development. I would pretty much describe that as an effort at skill development, becoming a slightly better basketball player so that I can increase my marketability in a marketplace. Now, that's not to say that there's anything wrong with that. In fact, I think that a young man or a young woman that wants to become a professional athlete, that's how they want to make a living, should have every opportunity to do that. Why not? I mean, what could be wrong with that? But that's fundamentally different than going to a university or a college to get a college degree and go through that human development process. Two distinctly different things. Only in America do we force someone to go to a university in order to pursue a professional sports career? Nobody else does that. Nobody else would even think that was rational. But we're doing that in some part here, and it begs the question, why? Why would we do that? If you look at the problems right now in men's basketball, and you start with just Division I men's basketball, you've got about, in any given year, 5,200 or so men's basketball players. Of those 5,200, I could ask Len, I suppose. I don't know, Len, how many out of the 60 in the NBA draft, or maybe David knows this, in the NBA draft, 60 people go, probably 40 of them come out of American colleges, handful of international players, something like that. So 40 or 50 or so people out of 5,200 play in the NBA. So we're talking about 1.5%. 1.5% who probably would just as soon have pursued some other avenue to the NBA as going to a university if it was available to them. We have every year a dozen or so, maybe 15 in a big year, so-called one-and-dones. Why were they in college? It wasn't for human development. It was because they wanted to develop their skills. We need to sit back and pause and ask ourselves, what are some of the fundamental relationships that we have going on here that are causing these distortions that really disturb all of us? You know, I've been asked in the past couple of weeks a lot of times, well, where do you think this investigation is going? How many more schools will be caught up in this? Is this just the tip of the iceberg? The answer is I don't know anything about the investigation that you don't know, and the FBI and the Southern District in New York will likely keep it that way. That's their business, not ours. But whether it's the tip of the iceberg or it's the whole iceberg doesn't really matter. It's disgusting enough as it is. And we got to recognize that we own that that's part of us that we're looking at. When we see a coach, an assistant coach making $200,000-$300,000 a year, taking a $10,000 bribe to throw some kid under the bus by steering him and his family to an irreputable financial advisor, you got to just be sick to your stomach. This kid has placed his entire trust in this individual, and for 10 grand, 20 grand, this guy just sold him down the river. When you see, allegedly, these are all allegations. I get that, and I have to say that up front. When you allegedly see a corporation spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to steer a kid toward, doesn't even care what school it is, as long as it's one of their companies, one of their schools, that ought to disturb us a lot. The sports marketing industry is some of the most creative people on God's earth. They are wonderful marketers. And you got to bribe a kid to get him to wear your shoes? I mean, something's wrong with that. And we have to pause and say, what's that all about? Is this all about kids trying to get into a professional program? And how do we help them do that without them having to go through a charade? Is this about selling shoes? And we're not figuring out how to help shoe companies do this without doing it dishonestly? We can figure out a better relationship there. We see people bribing young men or their families to become their advisee, let them become their agent or their financial advisor. There's some very smart financial advisors sitting around this table, right? I don't think we have to have a system where that's got to go be underhanded and under the table. How do we just move that up into the daylight? If somebody needs and desires and has a legitimate interest in getting professional advice, how do we fix that? We don't force people to get professional advice about their accounting career by taking a bribe from somebody. How do we fix that relationship? How do we make that work better? All of those things are distortions of what the fundamental mission of higher education is all about. And we need to be paying very close attention to it. And then we need to make sure that we can demonstrate to the world, that a lot of the audience that's sitting behind you there, that we in higher education are capable of self-governance. Because if we don't, somebody will. And I would encourage you all to think about who is it that would replace self-governance in higher education. when I hear that and think about it, I don't like the answers I come up with. They're not good answers at all in my book because I'm a higher education guy, and I like the way higher education in America functions. So what we've done, we being me and the Board of Governors of the NCAA, in order to address the basketball issue, is we've created a commission. And yeah, I know you're a commission and they're a commission, and I know people don't want to hear about process and they don't want to hear about commissions, and I agree with them. I agree that this is not a time to sit around and talk any more than is necessary. We need to act, and we need to demonstrate that we are, in fact, capable of resolving these issues, that we, American higher education, have the political will and fortitude to deal with some tough issues that leave things dramatically better than where they were when we started. But the only way to start is to have a really good conversation, an honest, frank conversation, and that's what this commission's all about. Some of you have volunteered, I guess it'd be a little too charitable, have agreed to serve on that commission, and I appreciate it enormously. But it's very important to know that this commission is an independent body. It is intentionally made up of people who are not content experts. With all due respect to David and Bud and your son, they're on that commission because they are people that are seen as people who understand the context of college basketball, not the content necessarily. That commission's going to have to go out and talk to lots and lots of people. They're going to have to gather information from all around the basketball world, including and probably especially people who engage in that world in ways that we find disreputable. But we need to get information into that commission. Secretary Rice is being very careful in organizing it to be an independent body, to reach its own conclusions, to not be an extension of the NCAA, to be a body that's truly going to go where they think they need to go, and bring back to the NCAA and the Board of Directors and Governors some direct and specific recommendations that will not just be incremental nibbling around the edges, but will get at some of those fundamental relationships that I was just discussing. What should our relationship be with professional basketball? What should it be with shoe companies? What should it be with agents? What authority should we have to hold ourselves accountable in higher education so that we can avoid this kind of thing in the future? What do we do to make sure that we're providing students themselves with a fair shake so that they're comfortable and completely support the arrangements that we're engaged in? Those are the things that commission is going to be looking at, and I think it's going to be very important that they maintain that independence and bring back to the board some very, very direct and very important recommendations. I think also simultaneously with the basketball scandal, we'll just call it that loosely, we also had findings come out around North Carolina. Now, we can all agree or disagree whether the Committee on Infractions made the right choice or the wrong choice. That's up to them. That's their job. It was, I'm not pandering to the co-chair of the committee, but that panel included some extraordinary people on it, people whose opinions the NCAA Board of Governors trusts, and they're empowered to make those choices. It does, however, bear being pointed out that only a very small portion of Americans believe that was the right decision, that North Carolina was being held appropriately accountable for the behavior that occurred, that too eroded confidence in higher education holding itself accountable. And therefore, we, not the commission, but we, higher education and the NCAA board, need to yet again say, all right, what do we want to hold each other accountable for? Is this something that we ought to be doing around academics more aggressively than we have in the past? Are the rules that exist, I know rules are boring and dull, but do the rules that exist today allow for that level of accountability, or is that simply a function of accrediting agencies? In which case, then, somebody needs to sit down and talk with accrediting agencies and say, here's what we want you to hold us accountable for. Because again, that too is a self-regulating, self-referential system like all of higher ed. And right now, people don't have confidence in it. So, let me conclude that, and there's many, many issues we can talk about, I know, but these are the big ones of the day, of course. It's easy to get hyperbolic. It's easy to exaggerate these issues when they're laying right in front of us. But as Bud knows, we had our board meetings this last week out at the UCLA campus. I told the board then, and I believe strongly today, that we cannot go to the next basketball season without seeing fundamental change in the way college basketball is operating. The public doesn't have sufficient confidence in any of us, and I'll take that on myself too. In terms of our ability to resolve these issues, we simply have to demonstrate that we're willing to and that we can, and I'm enormously confident that that's possible. So with that, Madam and Mr. Chairman, I'll pause for questions.
Thanks so much. Let's open it up.
Mark, I wonder if I could, I think we'll focus on basketball in a minute. I wonder if you could think a little bit more about or at least tell us a little bit more about what you concluded from the North Carolina case, specifically whether the definition of academic conduct, academic misconduct that I was part of the discussion on, ought to be reexamined. It seemed to me the infraction committee was somewhat frustrated by the words and the regulations of the NCAA, and could that be reexamined to look at disproportionate, for example, academic aid given to student athletes?
I think it has to be, Walt, and from your decade-long service on the Committee on Academic Performance, I mean, nobody knows that world better than you do. And when I look at those cases in general, let's set aside Carolina for a minute. It seems to me that we are at a place in higher ed, I don't think this is just an athletic issue, where we do need to examine what are the right, yet again, we've done this frequently, but yet again examine what do we rely on the checks and balances within a university to do, what do we rely on the checks and balances of regional accrediting or specialized accreditors to do, and what do we rely on an athletic association to do. One of the great problems in accrediting is that accrediting bodies basically only have two tools at their disposal: probation, which seems to have modest impact, and a nuclear bomb, deaccreditation. The dropping that nuclear bomb on an institution is to say we're going to close you down. This isn't like we're going to spank you or give you a scolding. We're going to put you out of business. Well, accreditors, which is to say, again, ourselves, because we are the accreditors in higher education, are very loath to do that. So, the Committee on Infractions rather came back and said, so Mark Emmert, go tell Sachs in this case to, buck up and do something tough. Okay, Sachs, put the University of North Carolina out of business. I mean, that's what their option is. So clearly we need some kind of system that's gradated. I think that similarly in the NCAA rule book now that's evolved over the decades, it's become pretty black and white. The definition of fraud is strictly up to the institution. I think as an academic, I see that as perfectly appropriate. But I have no doubt that the commission did indeed feel, the Committee on Infractions did indeed feel hamstrung. But they're hamstrung by, again, our own systems of saying, who do we want to hold ourselves accountable for what were, at the end of the day, academic failings, in my opinion.
Mark, a couple of questions I want to ask about football, but before we get to football, I want to go to the higher order question you raised because I think it's an important one. First of all, I congratulate you for what I consider to be a candid and realistic assessment of our ability to self-govern in higher education, at least people's perception of that. And I think that's the threshold question ultimately for all of us, is whether it's the future of the NCAA or just what's going to happen with higher education. What do you think is the future of the NCAA? Given a couple of facts, one is as you've always said, it's a membership organization. and there are pros and cons to a membership organization. But as we increasingly see trouble spots, whether it's in football or basketball or any sport, it calls into question our ability to self-govern. And that means the effectiveness of the NCAA. So do you think the NCAA can continue on as it has? If not, what are the kinds of things that you think need to be changed about it? And I think what also complicates that is that one of the biggest issues we have in athletics is the FBS championship. And the fact that that is outside the NCAA, the revenues don't come to it, and that in of itself causes a lot of angst and problem in self-regulation and where athletics are going. So if you take the threshold question first is, what's your perception of where the NCAA is going over the next 5, 10 years? Is it a sustainable organization as it has existed?
Well, first of all, I think it's really important, Scott, to recognize that the NCAA has constantly morphed and evolved over its century or so of existence. If you look at it in the beginning, it took 50 years before it decided to have an enforcement arm, because for 50 years it was operating under the guise of just saying, look, we trust all of you to follow the rules. Who would possibly cheat in college sports, right? See, that was a joke. I thought it might work, but clearly not. And the reality, of course, is that people have been misbehaving around college sports since the first college athletic contest. So there's nothing new there. And so it's changed, it's evolved, it's moved along in various ways, and I have a high degree of confidence that it will continue to do that and remain a viable, vibrant enterprise. In large part because you don't have a choice, Scott, when you stop and think about it. So let's just do the mental experiment and say, let's eliminate the NCAA. Okay, then what? Do we create a federal ministry of sport and let the federal government run it? They're doing a fine job of things. Do we create a new commission on college sport in America? Well, who is that going to be? I assume it's going to be university presidents, right? Because as a recovering university president, I'd sure want to control college sport in America. I wouldn't want to turn it over to another body unless I really wanted to really move a lot of things over there. And what will that body have to do? It'll have to organize championships. It'll have to certify people's eligibility to participate. It'll have to create an enforcement enterprise. It'll have to create a governance enterprise. Sounds an awful lot like the NCAA, only with a different name. So it really begs the question, sort of the Churchillian notion that we're in this self-regulatory model and it's the worst possible solution except for everything else. And I believe that's absolutely true. So if the university leaders who are the NCAA are incapable of reforming issues like this, why would they be any better in a different guise? Or the universities of America could all decide to turn all of sport over to some other entity, in which case that would be fine. We would have European sport, which, maybe that's what we want. Maybe we don't want to have sport associated with higher education, and we want to have an institute, a European, Asian model. But curiously, when I travel around the world, they all want to emulate our model because they hate their model, and they all think that having education and athletics linked together is actually part of the secret sauce of success of America because of all the lessons our children learn in sport. So I'm actually pretty optimistic in large part because it's the best possible solution. Now, having said that, we got to find a way to avoid having to careen from crisis to crisis to generate the political will to deal with some of these issues. If you look at men's basketball, I would contend that 95% or something like that, 90-some percent of college basketball works really well, really, really well. But we do have a very small portion, 2%, 5%, of people that really want to be professional basketball players. And they ought to be allowed to be professional basketball players. If you want to be a dancer, we don't make you go to Tulane to learn to become a dancer. We say, go be a dancer. There's a lot of institutes you can learn. If you want to be a tennis player, you can go to Bolletari and you become a tennis player. You don't have to come to Kent State to learn to be a tennis player. Go play tennis. But in basketball and football, we're forcing people into a system that may or may not want to be a part of it. And it's a small fraction, and it distorts everything. And we got to deal with that effectively and be forthright about it. You know, when you flip over to in the grand scheme of things, I guess more a pedestrian question of FBS and football, and you know, I think that football has, since 1983, a Supreme Court decision in '83, when the NCAA was prohibited from handling football TV broadcast. You know, when we got to that point in time, football has become the economic divider among all of the schools, and we all recognize that. If you have a successful football program and you're in one of the 5 so-called autonomy conferences, your economics look very, very different than they do if you're not inside one of those groups, and everybody here gets that. I think that it would be unwise to assume that creates some financial nirvana, because a number of those 65 schools are finding ways to spend themselves into a corner as well, because competing at a high level in the Autonomy 5 in football is a very expensive proposition today. And so, you know, when I meet with your colleagues, your former colleague presidents around this issue, they're very anxious for revenue, and they don't feel particularly wealthy, with 1 or 2 exceptions, or 5 exceptions probably. So, you know, having a model that allows for big economic diversity that we have just in Division I alone, I think makes it very, very hard, Scott, to come to consensus. And that's what our changes to the governance structure were all about just a handful of years ago. It makes it much more difficult to get people to agree on important changes that are made. And so when you have in one division conferences with $5 million athletic budgets and $155 million athletic budgets, it's more cumbersome. So would a different distribution of football money make some of that easier? Yeah, I'm sure it would. But I'm also not very sanguine that's likely to happen.
Just follow up for a minute. And this is on a personal level, because obviously you care very deeply about student athletes in higher education. That's always been the case. Do you think, going back to that 1980 decision about football, and then it morphing now into the CFP and the revenue that they have and all that revenue going there, even though the NCAA considers FBS part of a membership and a lot of it is controlled out. If you take that decision, you take what that ultimately led to, as you said, the autonomy conferences, or as others would say, the Power Five, and that autonomy now they have in the NCAA. Do those developments in your mind, have they weakened the NCAA? Have they created perceptions, if not reality, of conflicts of interest? You know, if we could do it all over again, would we have something like that? Understanding we have it. And no one's attributing, you know, anything to anybody. But the question is, has that contributed to the culture and environment we have today? Because we have that divide. Divide's getting larger. It's not going to get smaller. So what's your own personal view of it?
Well, we don't get to go back and redo Supreme Court decisions. So, you know, the whole football's relationship with the governance of college sport is the most complex of the relationships, right? It's really why the NCAA began 115 years ago, because of frankly, the carnage that was going on around football in America. And it was indeed an effort to address the kinds of things we're talking about today, and those issues haven't changed fundamentally. They've morphed, but they're still trying to make clear that this is about making sure that this isn't about getting an education, making sure that it's about the health and well-being of student athletes, making sure that the system is fair for everybody involved. And those definitions continue to change and develop. And I think that's all gone very, very positively. So I think criticisms need to be in the context of that the development and immersion of different relationships is nothing new in this arena. I think your assessment's right that the economic divides will not narrow because the only rapidly growing revenue source is confined to 65 schools, basically. The history of football having never had a championship, right? Because it's all a historical anomaly, right? The bowls got started, schools went to the bowls, a league conference championship was enough, and then you got to go to a bowl, and now we have a proliferation, to say the least, of bowls, and we all were unhappy with not having a championship, we the fans and everyone. So of course the schools invented a championship, and as a football fan, I would say that's been positive. But as long as my Washington Huskies get in every once in a while, I'm happy. But I think it has, because of that economic divide, it's created pluses and minuses. I'm a fan of what the autonomy decision-making process allowed. For those of you that weren't around, starting in 11, my first summer, the group of presidents, I guess, Walt, you were there. We're getting old, man. A group of university leaders came together, and we decided we needed to do a whole bunch of things to support students. We needed to eliminate the mandate that they only have single-year scholarships. We decided we wanted to change the availability of food for student athletes. We wanted to provide them with a miscellaneous expense allowance. We wanted to increase academic requirements, a wonderful agenda around helping students. And we couldn't pass it. Well, we passed it in the board. The board passed it twice, but it got overrode by the membership. The frustration out of that was driven largely by schools that said, we can pay for it and we want to pay for it. And the Autonomy 5 was born, in large part to do things that were very, very good for students. So do I think that was a positive outcome? Yeah, I think that was an extremely positive outcome. And schools that said they couldn't afford to do it now have found a way to do it. And anytime we're spending money to compete for how well we're taking care of students and their educational needs, I'm on board with that. Does it create this caste system? Yeah, it does. That's always been there. It just makes it, I think, clearer and the demarcation lines more explicit. Alabama's always been Alabama. Michigan's always been Michigan. And there's nothing that we can do to change that historical fact.
Mark, thank you, first of all, for being here. Obviously, I want to add to my appreciation, to everyone else's appreciation and gratitude for you coming before us. At our last meeting, we met with Dr. Franklin and highlighted the NCAA's diversity pledge. And it's great to hear that over 80% of schools sign the pledge, but obviously pledges unto themselves don't move the needle. And we know that the numbers with regard to diversity can improve greatly. We have to go from pledge to execution. I imagine that's obviously the next step. What do you think of the idea? Universities are already required by federal law to report graduation rate data for student athletes, as well as file gender equity reports. And that's accessible through the Department of Education. But what do you think of the idea that requires athletic departments to publish gender and racial diversity data for their departments, their administrators, coaches, athletes, and for access not only by the public, but by athletes who already are attending the institution, as well as recruits and their families? I mean, obviously, in my opinion, I think pressure needs to come from different areas in order to kind of spur movement in this direction. And recruiting is the lifeblood of any program. And, I think that, again, the pressure to execute has to be the goal. But if institutions are mandated to compile that information and even articulate it in a way that these families and others can understand, do you think that, one, that's a good idea? Secondly, If the institutions don't do it, obviously somebody else is going to do it.
Well, first of all, I think your base assumption's spot on, Len, and that is that pressure has to come from a variety of places. There's a lot of folks that would like, me included, to have an NCAA Rooney Rule. But the NCAA, as a collection of entities, doesn't have any legal authority or capacity for doing that. A lot of states' labor laws would forbid it, et cetera, et cetera. So there's just no way to do that, as desirable as that might be. The data on women and minorities in administrative positions, including commissioners, with due deference to the one to your left, is inadequate, to say the least. In many ways, it's embarrassing. So I would be very supportive of the kind of provision of data and transparency you're talking about. Again, the NCAA itself probably lacks the authority to do that because private universities don't release all their data, right? We run into this same issue when we talk about budgets. We'd all love to know all the budgetary data, and indeed we, the NCAA National Office, put together the best budget data. We also put together the best diversity data, but we can get it from our public school university colleagues, but we can't get it from our private schools. I'm not knocking private schools. They just have different policies as independent nonprofits than the public schools do. So having spent my whole career in public universities, I'm pretty used to all of that being right out there for everybody to see, and I think it has a positive impact. So if there are ways to do that, I'm not one of those that loves to run to Congress for things around higher education, but that's probably the only way you'd be able to force everybody to reveal those data. But I think they'd have a positive impact for all the reasons you just said.
Just as a follow-up, if they're competing for the same young athletes that come to their schools, if the public began that process, don't you think the privates would have to follow? They'd be forced to follow.
I would like to believe that to be true.
Hi, Mark. I want to get back to basketball for just a few minutes. You noted that the Rice Commission, as we're calling it, is going to get under many of the issues relating to the recruiting atmosphere and, in particular, the NCAA's relationship with the NBA. But I was just wondering if you could just talk about your own views on the eligibility rule, whether you think which direction should it go if what we have now, one and done, isn't quite right. Should it go back to none and done, meaning right out of high school, a player could be eligible to be drafted? Should it be something more than one? What might be realistic there, because we all know this isn't the NCAA's rule. It's a condition of bargaining in the NBA's relationship with its union. But if you could sort of preview that, and that's question one. Question two is, do you think that part of the solution might be in some better structure for the pre-collegiate non-scholastic basketball world, which, as we all know, doesn't have an oversight entity. High school basketball regulates through the states largely, high school basketball. The NCAA, however imperfect, as you noted, regulates collegiate basketball. The NBA regulates itself. And then, of course, USA Basketball has oversight over the national team program. But that pre-collegiate non-scholastic world right now doesn't really have a structure, an organizational or regulatory structure. And I know that's been looked at over the years. It's very difficult to sort of circle the wagons, I think, in that group. But I was just wondering, now that this, set of facts has been brought to bear, whether this is the time to try to double down on that effort, how it might be done, whether you think it could help. So a two-part question there. Again, I know the Rice Commission is going to be looking at all that, but if you had some thoughts on it that you could share with us, that would be helpful.
Sure, happy to. First of all, I don't want to presuppose what the Rice Commission is going to come up with. That's, again, entirely up to them, and the directions they go are going to be their directions. So let me just repeat things that I've said in the past and that I still believe is true today. As I mentioned in my opening comments, I don't think there's any compelling reason why somebody should be forced to go to college that doesn't want to go to college. I think that just makes no bloody sense. I mean, why would anyone do that? If somebody wants to become a professional athlete and develop the skills of being an athlete, then they shouldn't have to go to college to do that. Now, that presupposes that somebody else is going to provide those skills and that support, and for the most part, that's there in most all sports, but not entirely. So, you know, whether it's a one-and-done rule, whatever, the NBA rules and the contract between the Players Association and the NBA is their business, and they're going to work on it. But do I think that the one-and-done rule distorts college basketball? Yes, absolutely, and I've said that any number of times. Would I love something that looks like the baseball rule, right, where you can go on a high school, but if you come to college, you have to stay 3 years? Sure, I'd love that, but I think that's unlikely to occur because it's not in the economic interests of either the Players Association or the owners. So since we don't have control over that, we have to look at the things we do have control over and the leverage that we do have and how we can change motivations and incentives that make sense. And so I have great hope that the Rice Commission will spend a lot of time on, again, what does the transition, the development of a professional athlete, what does that look like? Right now in basketball, this is an overgeneralized notion, I know, but in basketball, because of what's going on, to your second question, what's going on in youth sport, high school basketball is diminishing very rapidly in its importance. Indeed, the very most elite players don't play high school ball. So now we've got pre-collegiate, we've got a non-scholastic model that develops somebody from 4 or 6 or 8 all the way through their career. Now they have to jump over here into a scholastic model for 6 months and then back over to their let's get rid of the 6-month jump. I mean, just, you weren't interested in that when you were 14. What in the world makes us think you're interested in it at 18? Just, you know, create a professional pipeline. I think that makes eminently good sense. If you want to get play ball in a scholastic model at the high school level, we, the NCAA, ought to be supporting that every way that we can. And I'm sure that there's tools and vehicles for doing that. We can influence the way some of the non-scholastic ball works by restricting the things we have control over, our coaches. We can tell them what places they can go to recruit and what places they can't go to recruit. And that has a profound impact on what camps are going to be held and what individuals are going to be doing over the course of their summer. So I'm very hopeful that the Rice Commission will look at all of that. But we do have, because of the youth sport industry, in all sports now, we've got these non-scholastic building blocks. You know, yeah, they're getting an education, but they're not going on in the context of traditional schools. And in some sense, that's emulating the European model of athletic development. Okay, fine. That just is completely different than what we do. That's why I started by saying we've got to always go back to what's our core enterprise, what's our business. Our business is educating and developing young people. It's not giving them basketball skills. That's ancillary to, not at the core of. And yes, we have young men and women who want to be professional athletes or Olympians at our campuses, and that's great. But they have to do that while they're gaining development as a human being and as an educated citizen. That's the challenge. Did I answer your second question fully? Okay. Yeah. Maybe not satisfactorily, but fully. But fully.
Good morning, Mark. Just a quick question. Can you talk a little bit more about the independence of the Rice Commission and how it's set up, whether it'll be run by NCAA employees or legal counsel? And then just one other topic that's been really hot lately that Val brought up earlier is the transfer rule, and the transfer rule and how you think about that as you move forward, either transfer while they're in school or the fifth year, the graduate transfer rule.
Yeah, so in terms of the Rice Commission, we're going to great pains to make sure it has a high level of autonomy. Yes, Bud Peterson and I are ex officio non-voting members on the commission. Bud because he's chair of the Board of Governors, and I because we'll be responsible for trying to implement whatever they come up with. The other members include only 2 individuals who are currently employed in NCAA, in the NCAA world. One is the athletic director from Ohio State, the other the athletic director from Hofstra. They're on the commission because they chair the 2 committees that have jurisdiction, if you will, among higher education for men's basketball, the Men's Basketball Oversight Committee and the Men's Basketball Selection Committee. So again, anything that comes out of the commission is going to have to be engaged in by those bodies, and so they're there as much as anything to help sell whatever comes out of the commission to the broader world. The commission is hiring its own outside legal counsel and its own outside media. It has its own website, it has its own email address, it has its own everything. We will not have anything to do with their communications or their legal advice. My staff will be there to do the research or any other work that they ask, period. So we're there, we being my staff is there as a resource, that's all. We didn't think it was necessary or a good use of resources to create a whole new staff structure for a 6-month-long group that's going to meet, 5 or 6 times.
And just thoughts on the transfer.
Oh, transfer.
That's good. Yeah.
Well, there's yet another working group on transfers. I think this is maybe the 4th. I don't know where we are, which simply tells you that this is a very difficult question. They are moving toward making proposals as we speak. I have said in the past, again, just my own views, and by the way, it's important to note I don't get a vote in this process, but the fact that students can be directed to what schools they can transfer to or not transfer to, what schools they can get financial aid from or not financial aid from by their home institution has never made sense to me. I think that's an inappropriate level of control. I also think that a graduate student who has done everything that you want him or her to do and managed to graduate on time or early has been successful. And I don't call those transfers, I call them graduate students. Nowhere else in higher education do we call somebody that goes somewhere else for a graduate degree a transfer. We call them graduate students. You don't transfer from one school to another to get a master's degree. You go to that school to get a master's degree, and they ought to be allowed to do so. Now, having said that, I think that universities that recruit somebody as a graduate student, for example, who know full well that this individual has no interest in getting a graduate degree and is simply transferring to play ball, and whatever their sport may be, that there needs to be some onus placed on that institution. There's a variety of options of what that could be, but the burden shouldn't fall on the student. It should fall on the institutions themselves. So if we're going to manage that relationship, it needs to be managed that way, not by controlling students so aggressively.
We're a little tight on time. 2 final questions. Let's go Sarah, and then David may have to close at that point.
Thank you again for being here, and it's very encouraging going back to some of your remarks with respect to the fact that you feel that you're in the human development industry. I think as I look at it as a former student athlete, I think since I've graduated, there's been tremendous gains made, and you kind of cited some of those with respect to some of the Power 5 universities and teams. However, I think for a lot of us, and I think even from the sort of court of public opinion, and again, you cited some statistics that show that we're kind of losing there, there's a lot of inconsistency with respect to how student athletes are treated, and then those all around them are treated. So as an example, as a student athlete, I cannot transfer to another school without sitting out, whereas a coach can transfer wherever they like. On another hand, you have $1 million assistant coaches, and you have student athletes paying for the value of their scholarship. I will go on record and say that I absolutely think that that's a tremendous value, and you graduate debt-free, and there's a lot of benefits that come from that. But again, the overarching narrative seems like there's a tremendous inequity. How do you think the NCAA can manage that moving forward? As you cite, going back to those statistics that you cited, how do you feel like you reverse those trends when I think these gaps, not only between institutions, but just that relationship between, again, the student athlete and everybody around them, seems to be going in a direction that honestly feels a little bit out of control, but moreover seems to really threaten the overall enterprise for the 95 or 98% of student athletes who really are having a transformative experience at their college campus.
Yeah, I think you're asking the questions that I ask my folks almost on a daily basis, because at the heart of this, I don't think we're in the human development business. We are. That's what universities do. They don't always do it as successfully as we'd like, and there are some people that are not being well taken care of in that enterprise of the human development part of it. I'm pleased that we've seen over the past 5 or so years some really marked improvement in the relationships you're just describing. We were just talking about transfers. I agree with you. The transfer rules right now are inappropriate for a lot of student athletes, and they don't work to anybody's advantage other than coaches sometimes, and that's not where the emphasis should be. And we need to be real clear about that and fix it. And I'd like to believe that the membership's on the verge of doing that. I believe that we need to do everything in our power to constantly be increasing the resources, including time, that's available to our student athletes to take full advantage of everything that's offered them in a great university or college, so that they get as much benefit from that as humanly possible. I don't agree and don't believe, and you weren't asserting this, but I don't believe that student athletes should be employees of their universities or colleges. I think that is exactly how you eliminate college sport in America, and if that's the aspiration, that will be successful. But that's different than saying we can't provide them everything that we can that's, as a judge recently wrote, tethered to their education. The move this past year that's just going into effect around increasing the time students have for themselves and for their academics, I think is a very important step in the right direction, but it's a step. We need to do more in that domain. We need to make sure that student athletes can take advantage of the preparation for life, whether it's time and resources for internships, time and resources for study abroad, time and resources to partake in part-time jobs, all the things that regular students get to take advantage of that athletes, because of their time demands, don't get to do that. Now, when I sit down with your former colleagues and ask them, which I do on a regular basis at every campus across the board, divisions 1, 2, and 3. I've done it at dozens of campuses. Sit down with all the student athletes and we talk about all those trade-offs, and I say, yeah, but is it still worth it? Would you do it again? They all say, in a heartbeat. So I believe, and all of our surveys suggest, that we're certainly on the positive side of the ledger, but that doesn't mean we can't do more, and we need to.
Again, thank you so much for coming. I'm honored to be able to serve on the Rice Commission. I look forward to working with Dr. Rice, a very impressive person, and some great people on that board. So I'm looking forward to that activity. That being said, I want to disagree with you just a little bit here, and I'd love to hear your comments on it. You make the argument that a lot of these kids that want to go straight into the pros shouldn't come to college, or why should they? Or why should they be forced to? And right now in this country, we obviously have this racial tension and racial divide because, a lot of people feel like the opportunities really aren't there for minorities and certain neighborhoods and certain types of people. And I think there's a real disconnect here. As the Spurs, I know just recently we did a demonstration before the game, after the national anthem, just to tell people to come together. And the reaction was visceral. A lot of season ticket holders threatened to get rid of their season tickets. And we did, no one spoke. There was just a rolling of words across the screen saying we need to come together. We talked a little bit about equality, but we need to come together. And so there's a very strong racial divide here that's coming to the forefront. And I think it's an interesting dynamic here. And I think that the NCAA has a great opportunity here to change this dialogue. There should not be this. we should be doing a better job of telling these kids or presenting to them the opportunity of coming to college and the benefits for the long term that they will have. Your argument at the beginning was a great argument. 20, 30, 40 kids are going to go to the NBA. The rest of y'all, we're your best bet, buddy. Come on. You need to come here. You need to spend time on our campus. Even if it's 1 year, even if it's 2 years, you need to be here. You need to make the connections. You need to see a different world. You need to open up your horizons. And that's what these kids need to understand. That dialogue needs to change. There needs to be, instead of having a dysfunctional relationship where the kids see the NCAA as the enemy who's going to pursue them if they take a little money here or if they do something wrong here, the NCAA should be that organization that says, we're your best lifelong friend. You come here and we will change your view of the world. We'll change your perspective and you will have a friend for life. And so, for me, I think both parties benefit from these kids coming to college, even if it's just for a year or two. If you have some of the best players in high school, why do we not want them at our university for a year or two? Why would we? This is obviously a tremendous business financially. It's a tremendous business for universities to gather alumni and bring communities together through their sport. It's been a tremendous thing, and I know you've made comments in the past about these bad actors, that it's all these bad practices and bad actors, but I would argue that there aren't as many maybe bad actors it's just not being handled correctly. Why would we not want the shoe companies involved? They do a tremendous service to our universities. They want these kids, sure, but we can certainly encourage them to use proper channels to get to the kids and to the families. They want to be exposed to them, but I think we can have certain control. I think we have this idea of amateurism for these kids and these families, and you're right. They go from a system in high school where they're getting free gear, they're getting whatever else, and then they come to college, and then they feel like they're just totally cut off. And they still have a likeness. They still have value. I would argue that Johnny Manziel, his greatest earning potential was while he was in college. He was Johnny Football. And we took away the opportunity for him to capitalize on Johnny Football. And so I think that there needs to be some more dialogue in that respect, in giving these kids some flexibility to we all acknowledge that this athletic career lifespan is a short window. And it's a great opportunity for these kids and these families. And I would argue that we should try to help them achieve what they need to achieve, whether it's in college or whether it's in the pros, and have the benefit of them on our campuses and experiencing a different world, a new world, and opening their horizons. I just think we should make a strong argument for them to be on campus. That's where I differ a little bit with what you said, so I'd love to hear your comment on that.
Well, first of all, I understand exactly what you're saying, and the biggest challenge that I worry about, frankly, around all sports, but basketball and football are the most challenging because of the professional aspirations of players. I mean, every kid that's ever shot a free throw has believed they were going to the NBA, and we know when we survey our men's basketball players, we get data that is just shocking. 75% of those 5,200 Division I athletes, 75% say, I'm going to be a professional basketball player, right? 2% will. So the other 73%, you're right. The best bet is what's going to change their life is being serious about school, getting a degree, and going out and having a career, making a living like the rest of us, right? When we survey Division II, almost half of the Division II men's basketball players say they're going to make it. And stunningly, most of all, 24% of Division III players say, yeah, I'm going to be a Division I basketball player. 0% are going to be. But nearly a quarter of them think they're going to be. And those are young men with some delusions that we don't want to go in and pop their bubbles, but we need them to understand that what's going to be the game changer in their life is getting a college degree. That's what's going to be the $1 million or $2 million difference in their earning potential in their lives. So you and I, you and I share, and I think I'm done. I hear you loud and clear.
The second panel will convene at 10:15.